Before we get started on the topic that we're moving into, I have a couple of inquiries and life questions that we're going to address that were brought up by some of our participants. So, interestingly, the theme for our questions really has a lot to do with relationships. And this is a really good way to start, I think, because what we're moving into now in our meditation practice is our relationship with ourselves. And one of the things that we have the opportunity to work with as we are developing a more intimate, kind, and compassionate relationship with ourselves is how our relationship with ourselves is often mirrored in our relationships with other people. And there is a very interesting and powerful opportunity that we have when we're working with our operations in the world and our interactions with other people, whether those are people that we have a physical acquaintance relationship with, or whether those are relationships with people that really exist in our own mind, right? They might be people that we know about that we've never met, that we still have a relationship with because we do have dialogue that's going on all of the time. And it's this internal dialogue, really, that I think is the most important thing to work with when we're talking about where we have power to begin to shift our experience of the relationships that we have with other people. So there are, again, certain things that we can control. And then there are certain things that are beyond our direct influence, our direct control. And I always want to bring you guys back and encourage you to focus on the places where you can exercise some control over your experience and the things that are going on in your life. And ultimately, what that always comes back to is you, because you have control over you, at least in theory, you do. You might argue that you don't feel like you always have control over yourself, but you have the opportunity to exercise control over the stories that you're telling yourself, how you're choosing to communicate, and how you are choosing to actually story or view the situations that you find yourself in, and whether or not those stories that you're using are helping you to create a better experience for you and the other person, a better experience for life in general. So the first question that was brought up was essentially having to do with how do we deal with situations or the stressors of being in a situation where we don't feel that we have direct control over our environment or the circumstances that are going on, primarily because we acknowledge that we can't really control other people. For those of you that have done Empower Thyself with me, I've told some stories about this particular topic. So some of this might be familiar to some of you, but I want to answer the question by telling you a story. And then you can try to reflect on how you might be able to think about your own personal situation and where you would have influence to navigate that in a better way for yourself. So my story has to do with my work situation. And I think that that is a common area that we often have questions like this, right? Because we're maybe working for somebody else, we're working with a group of people, different ways that they communicate with each other, different things that they focus on or talk about, and different attitudes. So I was in a situation where I was working with a group of people that liked to complain to each other a lot. And that bothered me. I found it stressful, right? Because it's kind of stressful to be around people that are very negative and focusing on negative things and just complaining and complaining and complaining, I find, anyways. And so for me, I had to go through the process of thinking about whether or not in that situation, was it going to be effective for me to directly address the behavior? Generally speaking, unless people are inviting constructive criticism, they don't really care to be critiqued on their behavior. Okay. So keep that in mind. It's different if somebody's asking you for your advice or your opinion, but for the most part, people don't like to feel criticized or to feel judged. And if we're honest, a lot of the things that cause us to be unhappy with how other people are choosing to operate have to do with the fact that we're judging them, right? For good or bad, they aren't fitting into our idea of what is appropriate, correct, kind, best behavior, those sorts of things. So what I ended up doing for myself is I really asked the question, what do I have control over? So first of all, what specifically was upsetting to me? And number one, this is the key that I think a lot of us have a hard time identifying at first because we have to get really honest with ourselves. A lot of times when we feel unhappy in our circumstances, there is a part of our thought process where we are playing the victim. Okay. Especially when we feel like I don't feel like I'm in control of the situation. So there's a part of us that feels like poor me, right? And we feel powerless. We feel bad for ourselves, or maybe we feel angry. It kind of depends on how we interact with that. And so, really, in life, regardless of the situation, the most helpful way to approach our life is to always remember I'm not a victim. Okay. I'm only a victim to the degree that I allow myself to play the victim. And then what's appropriate to address depends on the situation and the details of the situation that are going on. So sometimes in extreme situations where you're, for example, being abused, you need to remove yourself from the situation. You need to not be a victim in the sense of saying, I am going to take action to take care of myself in the ways that I need to take care of myself. For most regular situations, the victimness that we have are kind of in our own mind, like where we're feeling sorry for ourselves in a certain way. Or we're just feeling trapped and feeling like a victim because we're trapped in a situation that we can't control. So then we have to really look at where can I adjust my story about the situation and not behave in ways that allow me to feel like the victim in my own mind. Okay. So in this particular situation where other people are acting in ways that cause me pain and suffering, and I don't feel as if I have direct control over their behavior because I don't, then the answer for me comes in the form of being an example of how I would like other people to act. Understanding that we have, now this is going to go a little bit deeper than sort of our conventional way of thinking about things. Okay. So if we're thinking about our life as a frequency, okay. So if you are in, which is why situations feel uncomfortable to us. People that are angry are vibrating at a low frequency. People that are complaining are vibrating at a low frequency. Laughter and joy is a very high frequency, right? So generally, we enjoy feeling good. And when we're around low vibing people, negative people, we complain about that or we don't like it. So then the question is, okay, well, how can I be strong enough to sort of hold my space up here, take responsibility for my own emotions and my own thoughts and maintain that so that instead of me getting dragged down to the base, I can invite other people to rise up to my level of operating, right? And that takes a bit of fortitude and it takes some inner strength. But primarily, what we can work on is our own inner emotions and our thoughts around that situation. And so, how do I stay in gratitude? How do I focus on positive things? And when we're in situations that feel uncomfortable to us, really a lot of times the only thing that you can do at first, especially, is to try to make sure that you're doing the best that you can to think about all of the things that you're grateful for in your life and in that situation, even if it's not everything, because that really is the best way to shift yourself so that you're not falling victim to other people's behaviors. And it is difficult. I'm not saying that it's not difficult, but it can be done. And what I ended up doing in my particular situation is I know a lot of different practices to do to sort of clear energy in a space, to call in angelic assistance, to sort of alter the environment on a spiritual, energetic, quantum, metaphysical level, and kind of work on that level to try to, with the intention of not judging other people, but like, how can I create a situation where I'm maybe lifting things up? The question is, can I go into a situation and be a positive influence in that situation to the best of my ability? And then if I'm needing to deal with the stress that comes from the impact of that conflict, between where I want to be and the way that things are, then you just have to make sure that you're doing things that are allowing you to reset, to sort of de-stress. So that might be intentionally on your off time when you're not in those situations, doing things that you enjoy, doing creative activities, finding things that really uplift you so that you can at least kind of reset in between those difficult parts. So those are a couple thoughts that I'll offer about that. Basically about, what are some advices or some things that we could do to prepare ourselves or to shift our focus when we are anticipating having difficult conversations, okay? Difficult conversations with, maybe people that are difficult or just around topics that are uncomfortable. And how do you, let's say you have a conversation that needs to be had, but you have a tendency to run away from that because the scenarios that you're playing out in your mind are all heading in a not favorable direction. And so then the tendency would be, instead of addressing those directly, to withdraw from that and to not have conversations that maybe need to be had. And then also, being aware of what are some things that you can do to help you be aware of your delivery, right? How the way that you're delivering the things that you're saying can influence the way that that's likely to be received by the other person, right? So how can we optimize the likelihood that the outcome of the conversation can be beneficial for positive resolution or whatever the necessary resolution might be, and not unduly hurting the other person? Because sometimes, especially if we're talking about relationships and we're in challenging situations, we have a lot of emotions that are wrapped up in the situation. And so it can be challenging to come into the conversation from a clear place that's compassionate. So, I mean, a lot of this isn't like a super quick fix, but there are some sort of mindset adjustments that maybe would be helpful to kind of think about ahead of time. And again, I can only just speak to what I do. I'm not a therapist. And so there's a lot of other things that you can learn as far as, behavioral adjustment and things like that. But what I find to be helpful for myself is to, number one, recognize that sometimes when we have a tendency to play out the worst case scenario isn't always necessarily what's going to happen, even if it maybe seems in alignment with the ways that things have gone before. And so what I tend to do for myself is, first of all, try to imagine what the best possible outcome of the conversation could be, and then how that might play out. So how can I be sensitive to, the other person's feelings and think about, based on what I know of their personality and what they tend to respond to, can I communicate skillfully to connect with them in a way that is more likely to be effective? And that's a really key sort of thing. Sometimes we just need to learn to be more skillful in our communications. And the other thing would be then, within that context, to imagine, okay, what are some of the things that I might say and how might I approach those things, and maybe even write it down. So you're sort of walking yourself through the scenario. The other thing, if I'm anticipating being in a conversation that I'm afraid is going to be very uncomfortable, sometimes what I'll do is I'll say, okay, well, what's the worst case scenario? And how am I going to deal with that? Right? So then you at least kind of feel prepared. But I think, as far as how to focus the mind, is like going into and this can sometimes be a really hard pivot if we're not used to interacting with our life this way. But I will tell you that it's very effective. Be intentional and be skillful, and also go into every interaction focused on the best case scenario. Like, give people the benefit of the doubt. Okay, understanding you can't control their reactions, and all you can do is the best that you can do in that the words that you're choosing to use. And the other thing to be mindful of, and I'm mentioning this just because of the way that the question was posed, is that, because I know this can be true for myself too, the tone of voice that you're using affects other people. And some of us tend to speak more harshly, not necessarily because we're trying to be mean, but like the tone of our voice is just, you could say, naturally a little bit harsh. So, I mean, you can just intentionally try to soften that up a little bit. So maybe think of like, how would I speak to somebody that was really delicate, that was really going through a hard time, that I cared about a lot, that I was trying to comfort, to appear non-threatening to, that sort of thing. And the energy or the tone that you're delivering your words with can really make a big impact on how the words that you're saying are received by the other person, because people will respond subconsciously to a perceived threat. So after you make yourself not seem like a threat right off the bat, and for some of us, just because of how we're wired or how we have learned to cope with life, right? They're like coping mechanisms or defense mechanisms. We tend to be a little bit more on the hostile or harsh side of things. And just to be aware of that about yourself. It's not a judgment. It's just like, how do I sound to other people? And those would be some things that I would offer around that. And then the last question, which kind of I've already talked a lot about, is I was trying to think of how to bring some new ideas into it. So the last question is kind of about, if we're in relationship with somebody that is, I'll just say, repeatedly behaving or not behaving in a particular way that we might perceive to be disrespectful or hurtful to us in some way, how do we find a balance between this idea that it's my fault, right? Because I'm the one that's bothered by the situation, and the other person doesn't seem to be bothered by the situation. So it's really my issue to deal with. Versus the other side of that spectrum is, some of us might have a tendency to sort of shrink back, or, hide from conflict, or not speak up for ourselves in a way that would be helpful for us to do that, and address situations on sort of a functional level. Like, how do we have conversations to communicate with the people we're in relationship with about our needs and about situations that maybe we would request be handled differently or addressed differently? So again, that's a big topic of conversation. But the thing that I think I would want to suss out from that would be the fact that when we say things like, if you're triggered by something, it's really you that has the problem. Okay. I don't think it's healthy to imply or to extract from that other people don't also have a problem. Okay. Because sometimes there is something that would be helpful for them to adjust. Although, unfortunately, we sometimes are in situations where the other person does not have any desire to do that. And so, how do we navigate that in a way that is helpful for us? And really, the only thing that we have control over is how we are reacting / responding to the situation. So, again, setting aside extreme, like dangerous situations or abusive situations, the important thing to engage with is, where do I have triggers around what's happening? And is there something that I can work with in my own self so that I won't be bothered by that? And the reason that there is a lot of truth to this saying that, well, it's really you that has the problem if you're bothered by it, is that you can often ask this question: if this person did the same thing to somebody else, would the somebody else care? Because oftentimes that same behavior or interaction would just bounce off somebody else. Like, it wouldn't hit them, it wouldn't catch them, it wouldn't make them particularly upset. Maybe they would think like, well, you're rude, but they wouldn't internalize that, right? They would just be like, I don't know what your issue is, you're sort of a jerk. But they wouldn't be hurt by that in the same way. And so, there is an opportunity for us when we say like all of our challenges are opportunities for growth. The opportunity is to then ask, well, where is that coming from? And, again, to use a personal example, I remember, and sometimes we can't sort of get our mind around the root cause of that. And it just sort of hits us as an aha moment as we're just doing our work. And I remember, this was many, many years ago now, fortunately. But I remember that there were certain things that Dan used to say that really would make me super, super angry. And the story, and this I think for me was the key to identify, what's the story that's coming up when that thing happens? And so for me in this example, what would happen is he would say something and then I would get angry. And this is what my internal response would be: I'm never good enough. I'm never good enough for you, right? And one day that happened and I got really angry and I saw what I was doing. And I recognized the pattern that was causing me to have a trigger. I had a wound that was being sort of like pushed on every time this particular thing would happen. And once I recognized that and I named it, then it actually didn't have control over me anymore. Because then for a while, it would still come up, but I could see it for what it was. And then I could say, oh, that's that old wound that I have, that old story that I'm carrying that hurts me, right? And it really doesn't have anything to do with the situation. So how can I heal that? And how can I move beyond that? And so then I went and I investigated, where is that story coming from? Why do I have it? How can I reframe things? And now I don't have that come up for me anymore. So there are things that we can do that heal us on the inside so that, other people do what other people are going to do. And we're just not bothered by it in the same way. I mean, so in that sense, when people say it's you that has the problem, that's sort of how I think about it. We're the one that's suffering. So the question is, can we adjust that cause of that suffering and sort of reframe the stories that are feeding that suffering? Because the fact of the matter is, we live in a hard world. I mean, there are hard things that happen all the time. There are hard things that are going on in the world at large that we see that trigger us in certain ways. There are hard things that just happen randomly by accident. We get cut off in traffic or somebody's rude to us because they're having a bad day or something like that. And then we're in relationship with other people, and other people all have their issues too, you know? And so it's sort of like if we're going through life bumping up, like my issues are bumping up against your issues, and that's causing a learning opportunity. What can we do with that? And now what I want to do is introduce the topics that you're going to be coming into in the next couple of meditations, because I want you to be really gentle with yourself as we're going into these meditation practices, because we're starting to so you guys have all now learned meditations that you can go back to that are to help you relax and to de-stress and to disengage the sympathetic nervous system. Now what we're going to do is we're going to sort of lean in a little bit into ourselves and give ourselves the opportunity to kind of peer in and see what's going on inside of us and how we can bring more love and kindness and compassion into the way that we're engaging with our internal environment, because that really is one of the most powerful places for us to work when we are asking questions like, how do I operate in the world, where sometimes the world seems really harsh, difficult, hostile, and those sorts of things. Oftentimes, if we stop to pay attention, if we become the silent observer of the thoughts in our own mind, and we're honest about what we're seeing there, it is not unusual for us to at least sometimes notice that we're talking to ourselves in ways that we wouldn't allow other people to talk to us, right? Like if your best friend was telling you what you're telling yourself about yourself in your own head, right? Like, how would you receive that? Because sometimes we're very self-critical and judgmental of ourselves, which actually is not helpful to us. So there's a difference between being aware and assessing whether or not what we're telling ourselves, the story we're telling ourselves, the emotions that we are allowing to continue to cycle are helpful to us, and being aware of that and taking decisive action. There's a difference between that and being self-critical. Okay. And sometimes at the beginning, it seems kind of like a confusing line. So a lot of us are very good at being critical. And usually when we're very good at being critical of ourselves, we're very good at being critical of other people, because I'm speaking for myself, because one of my best skills was to be judgmental, right? I was super good at being judgmental. I'm still a bit judgmental, but I've really I don't experience myself judging myself or other people in the same way that I used to. And what I found is that as I have become more accepting of my own flaws, what I would consider flaws, I'm also more accepting of what I consider other people's flaws. And so it's an interesting mirror that we have, and an opportunity for us to work from the inside out, which can just make it a bit easier to navigate the treacheries of life. Okay? Because none of us are perfect. And the more that we can learn to have compassion for ourselves and kindness for ourselves, the easier actually it is to feel that for other people. And then we're all sort of on different ends of the spectrum, with that. So with this first meditation that's coming up next, it's called Self-Compassion Break. And for this meditation, it's a very helpful meditation if we're going through some kind of suffering right now, because it helps us to engage with it. It gives suggestions on how to engage with that in a slightly different way that may help you soften the conflict around the suffering that we're having, But what I want you guys to be really gentle with yourself about is I don't want you to pick something that's really hard, okay? Especially not to start out with, because the point is, and I want to be super clear about this, the point is not to traumatize yourself more, okay? The point is to help you learn skills to move through things that are painful, that are causing you some suffering, so that you can get through to the other side of that. And so you'll see what I mean when you do the next meditation. But basically, what you're going to be invited to do is to sort of gently think of something that's causing you a little bit of trouble, and then to restory how you're engaging with that and just bring some compassion to yourself around the discomfort that that's causing you, to help you disengage from this tendency that we have to fight ourselves all the time. Okay. So, one of the ways that I view these kinds of meditations that we're moving into as being very helpful is that there's this sort of strange phenomenon that sometimes the harder that we resist something, the more it stays, right? Or the more uncomfortable, or the more painful, or the more suffering around it. And so, in a lot of cases, if we just can soften and bring some compassion to the situation and just acknowledge this is hard, this is hard. And, everybody goes through hard things sometimes. And I need to be kind to myself, just like I would be kind to a child that was feeling some kind of discomfort and suffering. So, if you have something that's going on for you that you can work with, that's workable for you and that you can manage, then this will be a good way for you to do that. If you get to the point where you feel like it's not helping you, then just do something else. I want you to have a good experience and to be able to connect with the opportunities that are, with these. And this is where I was saying before we started the recording here, that there's a difference between not doing something because it's not helping you, like it's maybe too much for you right now. You have to identify, like, where's your capacity, where's that line, and not doing something because you're just avoiding looking at it, but maybe you need to lean into it a little bit more. And I'm going to let you be the judge of that. I really want you to approach this with a lot of self-compassion and kindness for yourself. So, one of the really interesting things that can happen when we're navigating difficult inner emotional situations is that oftentimes, if we just name what we're experiencing, it loses its power over us. And so that's really what I'm going to encourage you to notice as you're working through these, especially this next meditation that's coming up, is that if we can get to a certain mindfulness practice called noting, Noting, where that's exactly what you do, even throughout the whole day. Like something happens and you just name it, right? So you have an emotion and you say anger, that's anger, right? You have an emotion and you say grief, that's grief. You have an emotion and you say joy, that's joy. And you just name it. And that allows you to create a little bit of space between you, right? Because we've already said you are not your emotions and you are not your thoughts. You are experiencing thoughts and you are experiencing emotions. So if we can name that which we're experiencing, a lot of times it sort of allows us to disconnect from the power that it has over us. And so if we're having a hard time and we just say, that's pain right there, that what I'm feeling right now is pain. That happens because I'm human. And that will continue to happen as long as I'm alive. But I don't need to latch onto that and let it continue to cycle. And I also don't need to reject it. Okay. And this is what I'm talking about. Sometimes when something painful happens and we reject it because it feels uncomfortable. And so the more that we resist it, the more that we deny that we're feeling something, the more it stays because we're focused on it in a certain way. And so there is sort of this magical thing that happens a lot of times where if we just name it, it doesn't catch us in the same way. So I want you to sort of play with that in this next meditation and just acknowledge that, like, I'm a human and I'm going to have all kinds of different experiences. I'm going to have all kinds of different emotions, and some of those are going to be painful and some of those are going to be joyful. It's helpful for me to focus on the joy and the happiness and the pleasure as much as I can, because our tendency is to hyper focus on the things that are uncomfortable. Okay. And that keeps us stuck there. But in this meditation practice, it's going to kind of walk you through a process of connecting with yourself and with some love for yourself and bringing some softness around the experiences that you're having, so that hopefully you can simultaneously, as you're accepting this is happening now, it will more easily just move through you instead of getting stuck inside of you. Okay, so I hope that makes sense to you. The second meditation that you guys are going to be doing has to do with kindness for your thoughts, really. So this is sort of the same idea of how do we get stuck in these sort of judgmental circuits about our own thought patterns, and how do we bring some kindness to ourselves and kindness to the way that we're thinking, not only about ourselves in general, but the way that we're thinking about the thoughts that we're having. Because sometimes we do have thoughts that we don't want to be having, or that we would judge other people for having, right? That's usually how it is. So if we have thoughts that we don't think we should be having and that we would judge other people for having, and then we can be unkind to ourselves. And one of the things that I always say, to the people that have done initiation with me, and we were talking about the negative ego and the positive ego, which manifests in our thoughts. So the negative ego, you can kind of think as either your negative thoughts or the thoughts that you're having that are convincing you not to do something that would be good for you, which that's the tricky part of your negative ego. Okay. And then you have a positive ego, which is, you could argue, would be sort of like if you have the devil and the angel on your shoulder, right? They kind of make pictures of that. The devil on your shoulder is the negative ego, and the angel on your shoulder is the positive ego. So think about how you're speaking to yourself. And if you're having negative thoughts, to then again play with this, this dynamic that's a balance between not fighting or resisting or denying the thoughts that you're having, but just acknowledging them and then bringing some kindness and self-compassion. So then they can just go, rather than fixating on these things that disturb us and perpetuating that cycle. And so what I was saying is that a lot of times when people are struggling with negative thoughts, and then they kind of get more self-critical, because then you feel bad about the things that you're thinking, and, oh, I shouldn't be thinking that, and I wish I shouldn't be thinking that. And then you start to say negative things to yourself under the guise of being righteous in a certain sense, right? What I always say is your higher self would never be mean to you. So if your thoughts are being mean to you, they're not helping you, okay? But you also shouldn't entertain and sort of coddle thought patterns that are destructive to you. So there's a balance there. In this particular exercise, we're working on disengaging from self-judgment and judgmentalism and self-hatred, usually self-loathing, actually, if we're going to be extreme about it. But if we're honest, a lot of us experience these sort of kind of, even though it might not be global, they might be kind of situational self-loathing tendencies if we're thinking things that we don't want to be thinking, or that we're ashamed to be thinking. So, that's what we're going to be working with the next 2 weeks. And then these next couple weeks might be a little bit uncomfortable for you. I'm just going to say that. Hopefully not. Hopefully you'll be able to kind of find some balance there, but I want you to be really gentle. And if it's putting you in a bad direction, then just back off and go do one of the relaxing meditations. Or like after you do the meditation, maybe go walk outside and look at something beautiful, to kind of reset yourself.